The day we bought the farmhouse for $1 was the day our lives ended. Not in the dramatic way you might expect, not with blood or violence or some sudden catastrophe that makes sense when you look back on it. No, our lives ended slowly, piece by piece, stripped away from us by something that had been waiting in that house for longer than anyone could remember. Something patient, something hungry, something that understood time in ways that human minds were never meant to comprehend. My name is Marcus Chen, and if you're reading this, I need you to understand that everything I'm about to tell you is true. Every impossible detail, every nightmare that walked through our doors on legs that bent the wrong way, every whisper that came from walls that shouldn't have been able to speak. All of it happened, and all of it is still happening, somewhere in that house, in rooms that exist outside the floor plan we were shown, in spaces that the human eye refuses to see, but the human soul recognizes with the ancient terror of prey that knows it's being hunted. I need to tell this story before I forget it, before the house takes the memories the way it took everything else, before I wake up tomorrow morning and don't remember my wife's face or my daughter's laugh or the life we had before we saw that listing online and thought we had found the opportunity of a lifetime. It started, as these things often do, with money, or rather, with the lack of it. Elena and I had been struggling for years, ever since Sophie was born and the medical bills started piling up.
She had been premature, our daughter, born 2 months early and fighting for every breath in a NICU that charged more per day than I made in a month. She survived. She thrived, eventually, growing into a curious and fearless 5-year-old who loved butterflies and hated bedtime and asked questions about the world that I couldn't always answer. But the debt remained, a weight around our necks that grew heavier with each passing year, each unexpected expense, each emergency that drained our savings before we could build them back up. We were renting a 2-bedroom apartment in the city, cramped and loud and costing us more than we could really afford. Elena worked as a nurse, pulling double shifts that left her exhausted and irritable, and I worked in IT, fixing other people's computer problems, while my own life fell apart in ways that couldn't be solved with a restart or an update. We were surviving, but barely. We were together, but the stress was putting cracks in our marriage that we both pretended not to see. We loved each other, loved Sophie, loved the life we were trying to build, but love doesn't pay the bills, and the bills were winning. The listing appeared on a real estate website I had been browsing during my lunch break, looking at properties I couldn't afford and dreaming of a different life. I almost scrolled past it. The photo showed a farmhouse that had seen better days, its white paint peeling and its porch sagging, set against a backdrop of overgrown fields and thick forest. It looked abandoned, forgotten, left to rot in some rural corner of the country that time had passed by. But the price caught my eye and stopped my scrolling finger. $1.
I laughed out loud in the break room, startling a coworker who glanced at me with concern. $1 for a house? It had to be a joke, a typo, some kind of scam designed to lure in desperate people and steal their information. I clicked on the listing anyway, curiosity overcoming caution, and I read the details that would change everything. The property was real. The price was real. The farmhouse was located in a town called Millbrook, about 4 hours from the city, a place I had never heard of and couldn't find much information about online. The listing explained that the house was being sold as part of a historical preservation initiative, a program designed to restore abandoned properties by offering them to buyers willing to invest in renovations. There were conditions. We would have to live in the house for at least 5 years, make specified improvements within the first 2 years, and agree to an inspection process that ensured the property was being properly maintained. It sounded legitimate. It sounded too good to be true. But when you're drowning in debt and desperate for a lifeline, too good to be true starts to look a lot like exactly what you need. I showed Elena that night, after Sophie was in bed, and we were sitting on our secondhand couch in our cramped living room, too tired to talk but not ready to sleep. She looked at the listing with the same skepticism I had felt, the same disbelief that something like this could actually exist. But as she read the details, as she studied the photos of the farmhouse and the surrounding land, I saw something shift in her expression. Hope. Fragile and uncertain, but hope nonetheless. "It's probably falling apart," she said.
The renovation costs would eat up any savings from the purchase price. Maybe, I agreed. But even a falling apart house on that much land would be worth something. And if we could fix it up ourselves, do the work on weekends and evenings, we might actually be able to build some equity, actually own something instead of throwing money at rent every month.
She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photo of the farmhouse with its sagging porch and peeling paint. "It's far from the city," she said finally. "Far from our jobs, our friends, everything we know." "There's a hospital in the nearest town," I said. I had already checked. "They're looking for nurses. And I can work remotely most of the time, only go into the office a couple days a week." "What about Sophie? Schools, activities, other kids?" "There's an elementary school in Millbrook. Small, but it exists. And think about it, Elena. A house, land, room for Sophie to run around, to have a real childhood instead of being cooped up in an apartment. Space for us to breathe." She looked at me, and I could see the war playing out behind her eyes. The practical concerns battling against the desperate hope, the fear of the unknown fighting against the exhaustion of the known. We were drowning in our current life, and this listing, this impossible $1 house, felt like a hand reaching down to pull us out. "Let's at least go look at it," I said. "What's the harm in looking?" There was harm in looking. I know that now.
There was harm in setting foot on that property, in breathing the air that surrounded that house, in seeing what we saw and deciding, despite every instinct screaming at us to run, that we could make it work. But I didn't know that then. All I knew was that my wife was nodding, slowly at first, and then with more conviction, and that for the first time in months, I saw something like hope in her eyes. We drove to Millbrook the following weekend, leaving early on a Saturday morning with Sophie in the back seat, excited about the adventure even though she didn't understand what we were doing or why. The drive took us out of the city and into the countryside, through suburbs that gave way to farmland, that gave way to forests, the roads getting smaller and less maintained the further we traveled. The GPS on my phone started acting strangely about an hour from our destination, recalculating routes that didn't exist and announcing turns onto roads that weren't there. I ended up following printed directions I had brought us back up, old-fashioned navigation that felt appropriate for the journey we were taking. Millbrook announced itself with a faded sign that read, "Welcome to Millbrook, population 847," in letters that might once have been green, but had weathered to a sickly gray. The town itself was small, a single main street lined with shops that were mostly closed, their windows dark and their doors locked despite the fact that it was late morning on a weekend.
I saw a general store, a post office, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, and a diner with a neon sign that flickered between open and ope, as if it couldn't decide whether to welcome customers or warn them away. The people I saw moved slowly, deliberately, watching our car pass with expressions I couldn't read. Not hostile, not welcoming, just watching, waiting, as if they knew something we didn't and were curious to see how long it would take us to figure it out. The farmhouse was 3 miles outside of town, at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense forest before opening suddenly onto overgrown fields. I stopped the car at the edge of the property, and for a long moment, none of us spoke. The house was exactly as the photos had shown, and yet it was also completely different. The photos had captured the physical reality of the place, the peeling paint, the sagging porch, the general air of neglect and abandonment. But they hadn't captured the feeling of the house, the weight of its presence, the way it seemed to watch us even though it had no eyes. It sat in the middle of the cleared land like something that had grown there rather than something that had been built, its angles not quite right, its proportions slightly off in ways that my mind struggled to identify, but my instincts recognized immediately. Something was wrong with this house, something fundamental and ancient and patient. But Sophie was already unbuckling her seatbelt, eager to explore, and Elena was opening her door with a determined expression that said she had come too far to turn back now.
And I, despite the cold knot of unease forming in my stomach, followed them out of the car and toward the house that would destroy us. The real estate agent met us at the front door. His name was Mr. Thorne, and he was thin and pale, with eyes that never quite focused on what he was looking at, and hands that moved constantly, adjusting his tie, straightening his cuffs, brushing away invisible specks of dust. He smiled when he saw us, but the smile didn't reach his eyes, and his handshake was cold and limp, like grasping a fish that had been dead for several hours. "The Chen family," he said, consulting a clipboard that I was fairly certain hadn't been in his hands a moment before. "Here to see the historic Morrison farmhouse. Wonderful, wonderful. Such a beautiful property, such history, such potential." He led us through the house, pointing out features that he described as charming and full of character. Words that I had learned from Elena's HGTV obsession were code for a broken and expensive to fix. The floors creaked with every step. The walls were stained with water damage and what might have been mold. The stairs groaned as if in pain when we climbed them, and several of the upstairs doors were swollen shut, impossible to open, despite Mr. Thorne's assurances that they simply needed a little adjustment. But beneath the decay, there was indeed potential. The bones of the house were solid, or seemed to be. The rooms were spacious and filled with light from tall windows that looked out over the fields and forest. There was a fireplace in the living room, a clawfoot tub in the bathroom, and a kitchen that could be beautiful with some work and imagination.
Sophie ran from room to room, claiming each one as her own, her laughter echoing off walls that hadn't heard the sound of a child in what seemed like a very long time. Elena was warming to the house, despite its problems. I could see it in the way she looked at the spaces, not seeing what they were, but envisioning what they could become. She had always been the optimist in our relationship, the one who saw a possibility where I saw only obstacles. And here, in this broken-down farmhouse in the middle of nowhere, she was seeing the home she had always wanted. "What happened to the previous owners?" I asked Mr. Thorne as we stood in the master bedroom, looking out at the forest that pressed close to the property's edge. He consulted his clipboard again, that strange smile fixed on his face. "The Morrison family built this house in 1847. They lived here for several generations before the last of them passed away in, 1952. The property has been in the Historical Society's trust ever since, waiting for the right family to restore it to its former glory." "No one's lived here since 1952? Elena asked, frowning. "That's almost 70 years. Why hasn't someone bought it before now?" Mr. Thorne's smile flickered, just for a moment, like a candle in a sudden breeze. "There have been interested parties over the years, but the conditions of the sale are quite specific, and not everyone is willing to commit to the preservation requirements. The society is very particular about who they entrust with their properties." "But you're selling it for $1, I said. "You must be desperate to find someone." His eyes met mine, and for just a second, I thought I saw something behind them, something that didn't match the affable realtor persona he was projecting. Fear, maybe, or resignation, or something else entirely that I couldn't name, but that made me want to grab my family and run. "The society believes that the right family can restore this house to what it was meant to be," he said carefully, "and they believe that family might be you. The price reflects their commitment to finding stewards rather than mere owners, people who will care for the house and ensure its legacy continues." It was a strange way to phrase it, stewards rather than owners, legacy, as if the house had its own agenda, its own requirements for the people who lived within its walls. But Elena was nodding, apparently satisfied with the explanation, and Sophie was tugging at my hand, wanting to explore the attic she had spotted at the end of the hallway. We stayed for another hour, examining every room, testing faucets and light switches and door hinges, cataloging the work that would need to be done and the costs that would be involved. By the time we left, Elena had already mentally moved in, and Sophie was talking about the treehouse I would build for her in the massive oak that stood at the edge of the property, and I was doing mental math, calculating how we could make this work, despite the renovation expenses, despite the commute, despite every logical reason to walk away. On the drive back to the city, I asked Elena what she thought. "I think we'd be crazy not to take it," she said, and there was more life in her voice than I heard in months.
"Yes, it needs work. A lot of work. But Marcus, that house, there's something about it. I felt it the moment we walked in, like it was waiting for us, like it wanted us there." I felt it too, though I didn't say so. I felt the house watching, waiting, wanting. And unlike Elena, I wasn't sure that what it wanted was good for us. But I said yes anyway, because I loved my wife and wanted to see her happy, because I loved my daughter and wanted to give her a real childhood, because I was drowning in debt and desperate for any kind of lifeline, even one that came attached to a house that made my skin crawl. We bought the farmhouse for $1, and we signed papers that I didn't read as carefully as I should have, and we shook hands with Mr. Thorne, whose grip was still cold and limp and wrong. And 3 weeks later, we loaded our belongings into a rental truck and drove away from our old life and toward the house that would consume us. The first night in the farmhouse was quiet. Too quiet, I realize now, like a predator holding its breath before it pounces. We had set up camp in the living room, sleeping bags arranged around the fireplace that we had managed to get working despite years of neglect. The rest of the house was too dirty, too damaged, too filled with the accumulated debris of decades without inhabitants. We would clean and repair as we went, room by room, making the house livable piece by piece. Sophie fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the excitement of the move and the adventure of sleeping in front of a fireplace in what she called our castle.
Elena curled up beside her, one protective arm draped over our daughter, and soon her breathing slowed into the rhythm of sleep. I stayed awake longer, watching the fire die down to embers, listening to the sounds of the house settling around us. Old houses made noises. I knew that. The expansion and contraction of wood and metal as temperatures changed, the creaking of floors under their own weight, the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls. These sounds were normal, expected. But beneath those normal sounds, I heard something else. A rhythm that didn't match the house's settling, a pattern that seemed almost purposeful, like footsteps in a room where no one was walking, like breathing in a space that should have been empty. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself the stress of the move and the strangeness of the new environment were playing tricks on my mind. I told myself to close my eyes and sleep, and everything would be normal in the morning. I was wrong about almost everything, but I was especially wrong about that. The morning revealed what the evening had hidden. In the light of day, streaming through windows that desperately needed cleaning, I saw things I had missed during our initial tour. Stains on the walls that looked almost like handprints, positioned too high to have been made by any reasonable reach. Scratches on the floors that formed patterns, lines and curves that might have been random damage, but that seemed to suggest something deliberate. And, most disturbingly, a door in the basement that hadn't been on any of the plans Mr.
Thorne had shown us a door that was locked from the outside, with a padlock so rusted it might have been there since the house was built. "What's behind that door?" I asked Elena, who had come downstairs to find me staring at it. She shrugged, still in the optimistic mood that the house seemed to inspire in her. "Storage, probably. Old root cellar or something. We can break the lock and check it out later, when we've got more of the main floor sorted." I nodded, but I didn't take my eyes off the door. There was something about it that demanded attention, that refused to be dismissed. The wood was darker than the walls around it, stained or aged or perhaps burned at some point in the past. The frame was heavy, reinforced, as if it had been built to withstand something trying to get through from the other side. And the padlock, that ancient rusted padlock, had been placed on the outside, locking whatever was in that room inside rather than keeping intruders out. "We should leave it alone," I said, surprising myself with the words even as I spoke them, "at least until we know more about the house, about its history." Elena gave me a strange look. "It's our house now, Marcus. We can open any door we want." She was right, of course. Legally, logically, we had every right to explore our own property. But something in my gut told me that some doors were locked for a reason, and that what was behind them might not appreciate being disturbed. We left the basement door alone, at least for that first week.
There was plenty of other work to occupy our time, cleaning decades of dust and debris from rooms that hadn't been touched since before we were born, patching holes in walls where something had chewed through, replacing broken windows that let in the cold autumn air. I fixed what I could and called contractors for what I couldn't, watching our modest savings dwindle as the house revealed problem after problem, each repair uncovering two more that needed attention. And through it all, the house watched us. I felt its attention like a physical weight, a presence that was always just at the edge of my perception. I would turn suddenly, certain that someone was standing behind me, only to find empty air and shadows that moved slightly too slowly to match my movements. I would wake in the night to sounds I couldn't identify, voices whispering in rooms that should have been empty, footsteps walking in patterns that led nowhere. I would catch Sophie talking to someone who wasn't there, carrying on conversations with an imaginary friend she called the lady in the wall. "She's nice," Sophie told me when I asked about her new friend. "She tells me stories about when the house was young. She says she's been waiting for a family to come back. She says she's happy we're here." Children had imaginary friends. It was normal, healthy even, a sign of creativity and developing social skills. I told myself this, repeated it like a mantra, even as the cold knot in my stomach tightened with each new story Sophie brought home from her conversations with the lady in the wall. Elena didn't seem to notice anything wrong.
If anything, she was thriving in the farmhouse, throwing herself into the renovation work with an energy I hadn't seen in years. She painted walls and refinished floors and planted a garden in the overgrown yard, transforming the neglected property into something approaching a home. She smiled more than she had in the city, laughed more easily, seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight we had been carrying had lifted the moment we crossed the threshold. I should have been happy. I should have been grateful that the move was working out, that my wife was flourishing, that my daughter had space to run and play and imagine. But instead, I felt increasingly isolated, increasingly certain that something was wrong in a way that no one else could see. The house was doing something to us, changing us in subtle ways that I could sense but not articulate. Elena and Sophie were being drawn in, welcomed, embraced by whatever presence filled these rooms. And I was being pushed out, kept at a distance, watched but not accepted. The incident with the photographs happened 3 weeks after we moved in. I was unpacking boxes in the attic, sorting through the debris of our old life and trying to find places for things in our new one. Most of the boxes contained ordinary household items, books, clothes, the accumulated detritus of years spent living. But one box, older than the others and marked in Elena's handwriting with the word memories, contained photo albums spanning our entire relationship, from our first date, through our wedding, through Sophie's birth, and all the years that followed. I opened the album from our wedding day, planning to flip through and smile at the memories before putting it on a shelf.
But something made me stop, made my hands go cold and my heart stutter in my chest. The photographs were wrong. Not all of them. The ceremony shots were fine, showing Elena walking down the aisle, me waiting at the altar, our families beaming from the pews. But the reception photos, the candid shots of guests laughing and dancing and celebrating, those were different. In every single one, in the background, barely visible but undeniably present, there was a figure, a woman in a dark dress, standing in corners, watching from doorways, present at our wedding in a way that made no sense because I had never seen her before in my life. I flipped through other albums, checking photos from other events, other years. She was there. In family gatherings and birthday parties and random Tuesday afternoons, the woman in the dark dress lurked at the edges of our lives, a presence we had never noticed until now. Her face was never quite clear, always turned slightly away or obscured by shadow or blurred in a way that didn't affect the rest of the image. But she was there. She had always been there. "Elena!" I shouted, my voice cracking with something that might have been fear or might have been the beginning of madness. "Elena, come look at this." She appeared in the attic doorway, concern on her face, wiping her hands on a rag stained with paint. "What is it? What's wrong?"
I showed her the photos, pointed out the figure in the background, waited for her to confirm what I was seeing, to validate my terror, to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. She looked at the photos for a long moment.
Then she looked at me, and her expression was one I had never seen before. Pity, mixed with confusion, mixed with something that might have been fear, but not fear of the photos, fear of me. Marcus, I don't see anyone. There's no one in these pictures but us and our guests. Are you feeling okay? Have you been sleeping enough? I looked at the photos again. The woman was still there, clearly visible, watching from the shadows of our happiest memories. How could Elena not see her? How could she look at the same images and see something completely different? She's right there, I insisted, pointing directly at the figure, in the corner, dark dress. She's in all of them. Look closer. Elena took the album from my hands and steadied the image I was pointing at. I watched her eyes move across the photograph, searching for what I was showing her, and I watched as she found nothing, as her expression shifted from confusion to concern to something approaching alarm. There's no one there, Marcus, just shadows, just the normal background of a normal photo. She set the album down and took my hands, her grip warm and firm and grounding. You've been working so hard on the house. Maybe you need a break. Maybe we should go back to the city for a weekend, see our friends, get some distance from all this. I wanted to argue. I wanted to grab the album and shove it in her face and demand that she acknowledge what was right in front of her. But I saw the fear in her eyes, the fear for me, for my sanity, for what was happening to her husband in this house that she had already come to love.
And I realized that pushing harder would only push her away. Maybe you're right, I said, forcing my voice to steady. I'm probably just tired. I'll get some rest. But I didn't rest. I stayed awake that night, flipping through photo albums while Elena and Sophie slept, cataloging every appearance of the woman in the dark dress. She was everywhere, throughout our entire lives together, a constant presence that we had somehow never noticed until I opened that box in the attic of a house we had bought for $1. And in the photos taken since we moved to the farmhouse, she was closer, clearer, no longer lurking in corners and doorways, but standing in the middle of frames, her face almost visible, her attention fixed on something just out of shot, fixed on Sophie. I began researching the house's history with an obsession that consumed every free moment. The local library in Millbrook was small, but surprisingly well stocked with historical records, and the librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who seemed to be the only person in town willing to talk to me, was eager to share what she knew. The Morrisons had indeed built the farmhouse in 1847, as Mr. Thorne had said, but the story he had told us, the tale of generations living peacefully until the last descendant died in 1952, was incomplete. The Morrisons had not simply lived and died in that house. They had suffered in it. They had lost children to illnesses that doctors couldn't explain, spouses to accidents that witnesses couldn't quite remember, relatives to disappearances that no investigation ever solved. The house has always been hungry, Mrs. Hendricks told me, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if the walls of the library might overhear. That's what my grandmother used to say. She grew up in Millbrook, knew the Morrisons when she was young, said there was something wrong with the family. Something that got worse with each generation. They didn't build that house, not really. They made a deal for it, and deals like that always come with a price. What kind of deal? I asked. What kind of price? Mrs. Hendricks shook her head, her lips pressed tight together. I've said too much already. I shouldn't be talking to you about this. You seem like a nice man, Mr. Chen. Nice family. You should take them and leave that house before it's too late. Before what's too late? What's going to happen? But she wouldn't say more, no matter how I pressed. She simply gathered her things and disappeared into the back of the library, leaving me alone with stacks of documents that told only part of the story. I dug deeper, following threads that led through census records and property deeds and newspaper archives from the 19th century. The picture that emerged was fragmented, incomplete, but terrifying in its implications. The Morrison family had come to Millbrook in 1845, wealthy beyond explanation for a family with no apparent profession or trade. They had purchased the land where the farmhouse stood from a Native American tribe who had refused to set foot on it, claiming it was marked by something they wouldn't name.
The Morrisons had built their house in record time, completed in less than 6 months, despite its size and complexity, and they had moved in with a staff of servants who quit within the first year, one by one, refusing to explain why. The deaths started soon after.
Children first, always the children, taken by fevers that burned too hot or accidents that seemed impossible. Then spouses, parents, siblings, a steady attrition that should have wiped out the family within a generation, but somehow didn't. New Morrisons appeared to replace the ones who died, distant relatives or adopted children, or in some cases simply strangers who arrived in town and were suddenly part of the family, wearing Morrison faces and Morrison clothes and living Morrison lives, until they too were claimed by whatever hunger lived in that house. The last Morrison, a woman named Elizabeth who had lived alone in the house for decades, had died in 1952, under circumstances that the newspaper article described as unusual. Her body had been found in the basement, near a door that had been locked from the outside. She had apparently starved to death, though there was food in the kitchen and no explanation for why she couldn't have simply opened the door and left. The coroner's report, which I found in a file that Mrs. Hendricks had definitely not meant for me to access, noted that her body showed signs of extreme fear, facial expression frozen in a scream, fingernails torn from clawing at the locked door, gray hair that had apparently turned white in the final hours of her life. And in the margin of that report, in handwriting that didn't match the coroner's signature, someone had written a single word: released. I went home that night with my head spinning, with questions multiplying faster than I could process them. What had Elizabeth Morrison been keeping locked in that basement room? What had been released when she died?
And why had the Historical Society been so eager to find a new family to move into the house, to continue whatever cycle the Morrisons had started over a century ago? Elena was waiting for me when I walked through the door, and one look at her face told me something was wrong. "Sophie's been talking to her friend again," she said, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. "The lady in the wall. But this time she said something different, something that scared me." I waited, my heart hammering in my chest, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. She said the lady told her that soon she wouldn't have to live in the wall anymore, that Sophie was going to help her come out, that they were going to be together forever. The confrontation happened that same night. I went to Sophie's room, where she was playing with toys in a corner, seemingly oblivious to the terror her words had inspired in her mother. Elena stayed downstairs, too shaken to join me, too frightened of what our daughter might say next. I knelt beside Sophie and asked her to tell me about her friend, to explain what the lady in the wall wanted, to help me understand what was happening in this house that we had bought for $1 and were paying for with something far more valuable. Sophie looked at me with eyes that seemed older than her 5 years, wiser in a way that made my skin crawl. "She's been waiting for so long, Daddy. She made a deal a long time ago, and the deal meant she had to stay in the house, but she doesn't want to stay anymore. She wants to be free."
She wants to be alive again, and I'm going to help her. How are you going to help her, sweetheart? Sophie smiled, and it was not the smile of a child. I'm going to let her wear me, like a costume. She says it will only hurt for a minute, and then we'll be together, and she'll take care of us forever. She'll take care of you and Mommy too. You won't have to worry about anything ever again. I grabbed Sophie and pulled her into my arms, holding her too tight, feeling her small body against mine, and knowing with absolute certainty that something was trying to take her from me. The thing in the walls, the presence I had felt since our first night in the house, the woman in the photographs who had been watching us our entire lives. She had been waiting, preparing, grooming our daughter for some terrible purpose that was finally approaching its culmination. "We're leaving," I said, my voice strangled with fear. "Right now, we're getting in the car and we're driving away and we're never coming back." Sophie went limp in my arms, and when she spoke again, her voice was not her voice. It was older, colder, resonating with a depth that a 5-year-old vocal cords could not produce. "You can't leave," the thing using my daughter's mouth said. "You signed the papers. You agreed to the terms. You are stewards now, just like all the others before you.
The house must be maintained. The family must continue. The price must be paid. What price? I demanded, shaking Sophie's body as if I could shake the invader loose. What do you want?
A vessel, the voice said, and Sophie smiled again, that terrible adult smile on her cherubic face. A young one, full of years unlived, with a future that can be consumed. I've been waiting so long, I have been so patient, and now finally, I have exactly what I need. Sophie's body convulsed in my arms, and she began to scream, a high, thin wail of pure terror that cut through my shock and galvanized me into action. I ran downstairs, my daughter clutched to my chest, and found Elena already by the front door, her keys in her hand, her face pale with understanding. "The car," she said. "Now, don't stop for anything." We ran, but the house was not going to let us go that easily. The front door wouldn't open. The locks had somehow sealed themselves, mechanisms that had worked fine that morning now frozen in place, refusing to budge no matter how we struggled. The windows were the same, glass that wouldn't break even when I threw a chair at it, frames that wouldn't lift no matter how much force I applied. The house had become a prison, its walls closing in, its presence pressing down on us with an almost physical weight. Sophie was still screaming, her voice mixing with another voice, deeper and older, a harmony of terror and triumph that echoed off walls that shouldn't have been able to echo. I saw shadows moving in the corners of my vision, figures that might have been the Morrisons, all the dead children and spouses and relatives who had been consumed by this house over the centuries. They watched us struggle. They watched us fail. "The basement," I said, remembering Elizabeth Morrison's body found near that locked door. "Whatever's in the house, maybe we can stop it. Maybe the door in the basement is the key." It was a desperate hope, barely a plan, but it was all we had. Elena and I ran down the stairs, Sophie still clutched in my arms, and we faced the door that had been locked since before we moved in, the door I had avoided, the door that something inside me had always known was important. I grabbed the rusted padlock and pulled. It resisted for a moment, then shattered in my hands, the ancient metal crumbling like it had been waiting for this moment. The door swung open on its own, revealing a space that was too large to fit within the basement's dimensions. A room that extended into a darkness that had nothing to do with the absence of light. And in that darkness, something waited. I could not see its true form. I don't think human eyes are capable of perceiving it. What I saw instead was an impression, a shadow, a collection of images that my mind assembled into something approaching coherence. A woman's face, but stretched and multiplied, 1,000 faces in one. All the vessels it had worn over the years, all the children whose futures it had consumed. At the center of that amalgamation, barely visible, was something that had never been human at all. Something that had made a deal with the first Morrisons in 1845 and had been feeding on their descendants ever since. The bloodline ended, the thing said, and its voice came from everywhere, from the walls and the floor and the air itself. Elizabeth was the last. I was bound to the house without a family to sustain me. But the stewardship clause in the deed, the one Mr. Thorne always includes, creates a new bond, a new family, new children with futures to consume.
"We didn't know," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper. "We didn't understand what we were agreeing to." "No one ever does," the thing replied, and there was something almost like sympathy in its tone. "But the deal is made. The papers are signed. The child is mine." I looked at Sophie in my arms, at her face twisted with fear and pain, at her eyes flickering between her own and something else's. I thought about the life we had built, the struggles we had overcome, the love that had held us together through everything, and I made a decision. "Take me instead," I said. "I'm her father. I'm part of the family bond. Take my future. Leave her alone." The thing in the darkness laughed, a sound like breaking glass and dying stars. "Your future is almost spent, a few decades at most. The child has 70, 80 years of unlived life. That is what I need. That is what I have waited for." "Then take both of ours," Elena said, stepping forward, her hand finding mine. "Both of us, together. That's almost a full lifetime, more than you would get from her alone. The thing considered, I could feel its attention shifting, weighing the offer, calculating the mathematics of consumed futures. Sophie's screaming had faded to whimpers, and I didn't know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. You would sacrifice yourselves for her, the thing asked. Give up every remaining moment of your lives. Experience nothing more than what has already been. Cease to exist in any meaningful way.
Yes, Elena and I said together, without hesitation, without doubt. A long moment of silence. The darkness pulsed around us, considering, deciding. And then, impossibly, the thing laughed again, but this time the sound was different, almost gentle, almost sad. No one has ever offered that before, it said. In all the centuries, all the families, all the children I have consumed, no one has ever loved enough to make that choice. No one has ever been willing to give up everything to save someone else. The darkness began to recede, pulling back from the doorway, retreating into whatever space it occupied behind the reality we knew. As it faded, I heard its voice one final time, echoing from a distance that had nothing to do with physical space. The deal is broken. The bond is severed. Love is the one price I cannot accept, the one currency that has no value in the economy of consumption. You are free. Take your child and go, and do not return to this place, or any place where my shadow falls. Sophie went limp in my arms, truly limp this time, and when her eyes opened, they were her own, clear and confused, and blessedly, beautifully young. "Daddy?" she said. "I had a bad dream. Can we go home now?" We left that house without looking back. The doors opened easily. The windows met in the morning light that had somehow arrived while we faced the thing in the basement, and our car started on the first try. We drove away from Millbrook, away from the farmhouse we had bought for $1, away from the nightmare that had almost consumed our family. We never went back. We forfeited the property, ignored the letters from Mr.
Thorne demanding that we fulfill our stewardship obligations, threatened legal action against anyone who tried to enforce the contract we had signed. Surprisingly, no one pursued us. No lawyers appeared at our door, no court summons arrived in the mail. It was as if the house and its agents had accepted our departure, had acknowledged that the deal was truly broken. But I still see her sometimes, the woman in the dark dress, in photographs, in reflections, in the corner of my eye when I turn too quickly. She is fainter now, less defined, no longer lurking in our lives, but not entirely gone either. A reminder, perhaps, a warning, or simply a shadow of what almost was, lingering at the edges of our reality. Sophie doesn't remember any of it. The lady in the wall, the thing in the basement, the night her parents offered their futures to save her. She is 7 now, healthy and happy, growing up in a small apartment in a city far from Millbrook, far from any town that might harbor something like what we escaped. She has imaginary friends still, as children do, but they are ordinary imaginations, playmates who exist only in her mind and never whisper about deals or wearing her like a costume. Elena and I don't talk about what happened, not directly, but sometimes, late at night, when Sophie is asleep and the house is quiet, we hold each other and acknowledge with our touch what we can't say with words, that we almost lost everything, that we survived only through a love strong enough to break an ancient evil's hold, that we are still here, still together, still a family. We bought a farmhouse for $1, and now we know why it was priced so low. Some bargains cost more than money. Some deals extract payment in currencies that can't be measured or replaced. And some houses are hungry in ways that have nothing to do with the physical world. If you ever see a listing like that, a property too good to be true, a price that seems impossible, I want you to remember our story.
I want you to remember that there are things in this world that prey on desperation and hope, that wait patiently for families foolish enough to take what's offered without asking what's really being bought and sold. And I want you to remember this: love is the one thing they can't consume. Love is the price they can't accept. If you ever find yourself facing something ancient and hungry and impossible, if you ever have to make a choice between yourself and someone you love, choose them. Choose them without hesitation, without regret, without counting the cost. It might be the only thing that saves you. This is Marcus Chen, signing off. The farmhouse is behind us now. The nightmare is over. But somewhere in Millbrook, at the end of a dirt road that winds through dense forest, a house sits empty, waiting for its next family. Mr. Thorne is probably placing ads even now, looking for desperate people who will see $1 and think they've found the opportunity of a lifetime. I hope they're smarter than we were. I hope they see the warning signs and walk away. I hope they never learn what we learned about the true cost of that house and the thing that lives in its walls. But I fear they won't.
I fear that somewhere, right now, a family is loading their belongings into a rental truck, excited about their new beginning, driving toward a house that has been waiting for them since before they were born. And the house is hungry. It's always hungry.